woman named Berna Gómez had been completely blind for 16 years. In a laboratory in Spain, a neuroscientist named Eduardo Fernández implanted a tiny array of electrodes into the visual cortex at the back of her brain. A cable connected the implant to a processor. The processor connected to a small camera. And when the system was turned on, Berna reported something she hadn't experienced in over a decade. She could perceive shapes, lines, the outlines of letters, not through her eyes. Her eyes hadn't worked in 16 years, not through her optic nerve. The signal never touched it. She perceived these shapes because a camera captured visual information from the outside world. A processor translated it into electrical patterns, and those patterns were delivered directly to the part of her brain responsible for seeing. And her brain accepted them as sight. That moment didn't just change one woman's life. It challenged one of the oldest assumptions in medicine. For as long as humans have understood vision, one rule has held. If the biological pathway between the eye and the brain is broken, truly broken, sight cannot be restored. You can treat cataracts. You can correct a lens. You can manage pressure inside the eye. But if the retina is destroyed, or the optic nerve is severed, or the eye itself is gone, that was it. Permanent. Irreversible. Every ophthalmologist on Earth learned this as a foundational fact. And for centuries it was true. Because every attempt to restore vision relied on having at least some part of that biological pathway still functioning. The most well-known attempt was the Argus II, built by a California-based company called Second Sight. It was approved by the FDA in 2013 and by Health Canada in 2014. Surgeons at Toronto Western Hospital in Canada became one of the leading centers for implanting the device, eventually performing 11 procedures. The Argus II was considered a genuine breakthrough at the time. It worked by placing a tiny electrode array on the surface of the retina. An external camera mounted on a pair of glasses captured images and processed them into electrical patterns. Those patterns were transmitted wirelessly to the retinal implant. The implant then stimulated whatever surviving retinal cells remained, and those cells sent signals through the optic nerve to the brain. It worked, partially. Recipients could perceive light and dark contrast. Some could detect basic shapes and edges. Some could locate doorways and track movement. For people who had been living in complete darkness, even that limited vision was life-changing. But there was a hard limitation built into the entire design. The Argus II needed surviving retinal cells to function. If the retina was too damaged, or if it was gone entirely, the device had nothing to stimulate. And even when the retina was viable, the signal still needed the optic nerve to carry it the rest of the way to the brain. If the optic nerve was atrophied, severed, or never developed, the signal stopped. It was like building a better microphone for a phone line that had already been cut. The sound quality was perfect. It just had nowhere to go. And that's the category of blindness that affects some of the most severely impacted people in the world. People with completely destroyed retinas from diseases like retinitis pigmentosa or diabetic retinopathy. People with severed or undeveloped optic nerves. People who lost their eyes entirely to trauma, infection, or cancer. Some people born with severely damaged or incomplete visual pathways. For all of these people, the Argus II was irrelevant. The hardware needed biological infrastructure that no longer existed. Then the situation got worse. Second Sight discontinued the Argus II in 2019 and nearly collapsed as a company in 2020. The manufacturer that built the most advanced commercial bionic eye effectively abandoned its own patients. According to IEEE Spectrum, hundreds of recipients were left with implants inside their bodies that could no longer be serviced, calibrated, or replaced. Some described the experience as going blind a second time, not because the implant failed all at once, but because there was no longer anyone to call when it started to degrade. The technology didn't just fail, the company behind it disappeared. That's the context you need to understand what came next. Because while Second Sight was collapsing, researchers on 2 other continents were working on a completely different approach. One that didn't need the retina, didn't need the optic nerve, didn't need the eye to exist at all. The first group is at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Their system is called Gennaris. It consists of a head-mounted camera, a wireless transmitter, a vision processor, and a set of small tiles that are implanted directly onto the surface of the visual cortex, the region at the back of the brain where vision is actually processed. The camera captures the environment, the processor translates it into structured electrical signals, and the tiles deliver those signals directly to the cortex. No retina involved. No optic nerve required. The system flies over the entire biological pathway and delivers visual information straight to its final destination. The second group is led by Eduardo Fernández at Miguel Hernández University in Spain, working in collaboration with researchers at the University of Utah in the United States. Their approach uses a device called the Utah Electrode Array, a small grid of tiny electrodes that penetrate the surface of the visual cortex. It was this system that Berna Gómez received. A camera captured visual data, a processor converted it into cortical stimulation patterns, and the electrode array delivered those patterns directly to her brain. The results, published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, were described carefully by the research team. Berna did not suddenly see the world in high definition. She did not look around and read signs or recognize landscapes. What she perceived were phosphons, small points and patterns of light created by the electrical stimulation of cortical neurons. Using those phosphines, she could identify simple shapes. She could distinguish letters. She could perceive the boundaries of objects placed in front of her. And she could do this consistently across multiple sessions, using a part of her brain that had received no natural visual input for 16 years. Now here's where precision matters. Because the difference between what Berna experienced and what you and I experience as vision is enormous. She was not seeing in the way a sighted person sees. She was perceiving structured patterns of light, closer to viewing the world through a very low-resolution grid than through a biological eye. There was no color, there was no fine detail. There was no depth perception in the way we understand it. The system delivered the simplest possible version of visual information. But for someone who has lived in complete darkness for 16 years, that grid is not a limitation. It is a revelation. Imagine spending 16 years without any visual perception at all. Not dim light, not blurred shapes, absolute nothing. And then one afternoon you perceive the outline of a letter on a screen in front of you. You can't see the color of the screen. You can't see the room around you. But you know the letter is there. You know its shape. You know where it sits in your visual field. For the first time in 16 years, your brain is processing information from the outside world through a sense you thought was gone forever. That is what the cortical approach is beginning to deliver. It is early, it is limited, and it is extraordinary. But this is where we need to talk about the hard realities. Because what works in a research laboratory with a single carefully selected patient does not automatically translate to a safe, scalable, affordable solution for millions of blind people around the world. The first concern is the surgery. Both the Monash system and the Utah Electrode Array require brain surgery. Electrodes are placed on or into the surface of the visual cortex at the back of the brain. Any neurosurgical procedure carries risk: infection, bleeding, swelling, damage to surrounding tissue. These risks are significant. The patients who received these early implants accepted them because they had no other option. But scaling cortical vision systems to a wider population means proving the procedure is safe enough to justify the benefit, especially when the visual output is still very limited. The second concern is longevity. How long does a cortical implant last? Brain tissue reacts to foreign objects over time. Scar tissue forms around the electrodes. Signal quality can degrade as the biological response to the implant changes. The Argus II faced this exact problem. Some patients reported declining performance over the years. And when second sight disappeared, there was nobody to replace or repair aging hardware. Monash and the Spanish team will need to demonstrate that their cortical interfaces maintain stable signal quality over years, and ideally decades before this can become a standard clinical treatment. The third concern is resolution. Berna Gómez perceived shapes, letters, and basic patterns. That's meaningful, but it's nowhere near functional vision. She couldn't read a book. She couldn't navigate a busy street. She couldn't recognize a face across a room. Improving resolution means placing more electrodes across a larger area of the visual cortex with greater precision. That increases surgical complexity, increases risk, and requires processing hardware that can manage vastly more data in real time. The gap between where cortical vision is today and where fully functional artificial sight would need to be is enormous. Closing that gap will take years of iterative engineering and clinical testing. The fourth concern is cost and accessibility. Brain-computer interface surgery is expensive. The device itself, the surgical team, the postoperative monitoring, the ongoing calibration. This is not a pair of glasses from a pharmacy shelf. Early-stage neural implants typically cost tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. For the communities most affected by severe blindness, in lower-income countries, in rural areas, among elderly populations with limited insurance, the cost may be prohibitive without massive public funding or dramatic manufacturing scale cost reduction. And the fifth concern is one the field has already learned the hard way. What happens to patients if the organization behind the technology fails? Second Sight already answered that question. Hundreds of people were left with implants inside their bodies and no manufacturer to service them. If Monash or any future company follows the same path, funding rounds, clinical trials, maybe approval, maybe acquisition, maybe insolvency, the patients carry the risk of that uncertainty inside their skulls. Literally, these are not arguments against the technology. They are arguments for being honest about where it stands. This is not a finished product. It is a proof of principle, a powerful one. Because what these researchers actually proved is something that matters more than any single device. They proved that the human brain can accept artificial visual input delivered directly to the cortex and interpret it as sight. That the biological pathway between the eye and the brain, the retina, the optic nerve, every relay point along the way, is not strictly necessary for visual perception. The brain just needs a signal it can understand. And if you deliver that signal to the right place, the cortex responds. That is not a product announcement. That is a shift in what we understand about human biology. For centuries, practical medicine treated vision as something that required working eyes or a working visual pathway. These experiments demonstrated that vision requires a brain willing to process a signal. The eye was always just one possible delivery mechanism. The cortex was always doing the actual seeing. And now there are machines that can deliver to the cortex directly. What that means for the future of blindness treatment is difficult to overstate. Not because these devices will cure blindness tomorrow. They won't. The resolution is too low, the surgery is too invasive, the cost is too high, the long-term safety is unproven. But the principle that the cortex can be addressed directly, bypassing every damaged or missing structure in between, opens a door that had been considered permanently sealed. Every future improvement in electrode density, signal processing, surgical technique, and brain-computer interface miniaturization now has a destination to aim for. The cortex accepts the signal. That has been demonstrated. Everything else becomes a long engineering and clinical problem. And engineering and clinical problems, given enough time and enough reason to solve them, get solved. Canada implanted some of the first bionic eyes. Australia designed a system that bypasses the eye entirely. Spain proved that a brain that hasn't received visual input in 16 years can still learn to see from a machine. Each step built on the last. And together they proved something that matters more than any single device ever could. Berna Gómez sat in a chair in a laboratory in Spain. A device was turned on. And for the first time in 16 years, she perceived a shape. Not through her eyes, not through her optic nerve, through a camera, a processor, and a small grid of electrodes touching the surface of her brain. She didn't see the world the way you do, not even close. But she saw something. And what she saw proved that blindness caused by a broken pathway may not have to be permanent after all. The eye didn't work, the nerve didn't work, the brain worked. And that changed everything.